Because before all the wealth, before the influence, before all of the international scandals, Robert Maxwell was actually someone else entirely. He was born as John Ludwig Hock in 1923 in Czechoslovakia. Now, the area that he was born in was a small royal village, and it was very poor, isolated, and, truth be told, forgotten by the centers of power. Now, his family was Jewish Orthodox and struggling to survive in a region where poverty, if the truth be told, was just normal and opportunity was non existent. And yet, somehow, this boy would eventually become one of the most controversial media figures in modern European history. Now, there is a real question. What is that? Because it's not what he became. The real question is how he became that person. See, folks, war changes everything. When World War II erupted, everything around it collapsed, okay? Eastern Europe became a battlefield of ideology, occupation, and extermination. And for the Jewish families like his, the Hawks, it actually became a matter of survival. Now, the system of genocide, now known as the Holocaust, all right, that swept through all of the regions of Europe at that time. And then when it did, entire families disappeared. You heard that right. Completely vanished. Some communities were actually erased. Their records were destroyed. Maxwell's family would not survive intact. You have to remember that. Robert Maxwell, he fled alone. Now, he literally was the boy who survived alone. There are no countable words for what Robert Maxwell actually went through. Think about this. He was a teenager moving across war-torn Europe. He had no stable identity. He had no protection. Literally, he had no guarantee that he would be alive the next day, like meaning tomorrow. He learned quickly that survival required adaptation, language, deception, speed, and instinct, and something much more deeper. That is a refusal to ever be powerless again. Now listen, this becomes the core psychological aspect of Robert Maxwell's entire life. So where was his rebirth? That happened in Britain. Eventually, he reached the UK. And like many survivors of war, especially World War II, he did not remain the person that he was. He joined the British military. And listen, here's something unusual that happened. He did not just survive military life. No, he excelled in it. He was intelligent. He was aggressive. He was strategic. He learned how systems worked, how hierarchy actually functioned, and most importantly, how information actually moves. See, during this period, he was involved in intelligence-adjacent military operations. Now, at the time, it wasn't officially labeled as espionage, but it was close enough to espionage. Now, this is where historians, they start to really speculate on the connections with intelligence services, such as MI6, the Allied wartime intelligence networks that were going on. Because listen, in wartime Europe, lines between soldiers, informant, and spies, they're really gray. They were often really blurred. And Maxwell's existed in that blur. You got to understand, after the war, John Hawk disappeared and Robert Maxwell was born. A new identity, a new voice, a new life. He chose the name Robert Maxwell. People said he chose it because it sounded respectable, British, and established. See, it wasn't just a name change. It was a full psychological reset he was trying to do. From a refugee to an operator. From survivor to builder. The first step into power publishing. See, Robert Maxwell entered publishing not because it was glamorous, but because it was powerful. After the war, he understood something really early. If you control information, you can control perception. And if you can, because of that, he acquired the Paragon Press. Now look, at first it looked harmless. An academic publishing scientific journals. There were so many of them back then in the 40s and 50s, but underneath that, something much larger, okay? Universities at that time were expanding rapidly. Research was absolutely exploding. And Maxwell, well, he positioned himself at the center of that knowledge distribution. He didn't just sell information. He controlled how the information flew. Now we got to look at the personality, basically, of the power. See, people who worked with Robert Maxwell described him in contradictions. Brilliant, but unstable. Charismatic, but absolutely terrifying. Visionary, but controlling. He would explode in meetings, humiliating executives, firing people instantly, but he saw patterns that other people missed. He understood that media, it was not just business. Media was leverage. Political ambitions. You got to understand, he had a lot of them. Maxwell entered politics and he became a member of parliament for the Labor Party. But politics, that did not tame him at all, okay? It actually exposed him. Colleagues began to distrust him. Robert Maxwell's personality basically created friction. His ambition created enemies, and his methods created suspicion. See, politics for Robert Maxwell, it was not the destination. It really was just another system to understand. He did get into a media empire war, though. See, in the 1980s, he made the biggest move of his career. He bought Mirror Group newspapers, now including the Daily Mirror. Now, he actually controlled mass media influence, and with that came rivalry, especially with the infamous Rupert Murdoch. We all, if you know entertainment history, you know that name. Now you had two giants, two empires, two compelling different visions of media power. But beneath the business war was something deeper. That was a control over narrative itself. And people do talk about his intelligence work. So we're going to look into that a little bit. As Robert Maxwell's influence grew, so did all the rumors. Whispers that were never fully disappeared. But he had connections to intelligence agencies, right? Most commonly was the Mossad, all right? But he also had links to, hold on a second, to the CIA, to the KGB. Conflicting claims actually offered no proof, but persistent speculation. The idea was that he was a traditional spy. Okay? But something much more useful. A node of information. A man who controlled media, finance, and access. You're going to have to remember those three things there. And in intelligence terms, that is far more valuable than a single agent. That's why they said he wasn't like a regular agent. How deep did the intelligence theory actually go? That is a great question. This is where Robert Maxwell's story actually truly became, if you will, controversial. Because the claims, they're really not simple. They're actually layered. Some of the journalists and researchers actually suggested that he acted as a broker between different states, not loyal to one side or the other. Robert Maxwell basically felt he was basically useful to many. He was a man who could move information through media channels, access political figures that other people couldn't regularly access. He could travel across the globe and hang out in elite circles and influence public perception as a result. There are also claims to specific intelligence linked incidents, which actually included indirect involvement, right, in a global political intelligence case. One of those that's often discussed, we're going to use as an example, the Murdache Vanyo, that is the person who exposed Israel's nuclear program and was later abducted and returned to Israel under intelligence operations, okay? Now, some writers have actually speculated that Robert Maxwell's media and connections may have played an indirect role in identifying or tracking individuals like Van Yuno. But it must be stated clearly, folks, that none of these claims that we just discussed have actually been definitively proven, meaning absolute proven. What remains is pure speculation patterns and unanswered questions. But, as we all know, in true crime storytelling, patterns actually matter. Because where there is smoke repeatedly across numerous different decades, people begin to ask whether there was ever an actual fire. So, did he have debt? Yes, he did. Behind Robert Maxwell's empire, something was breaking. That something was debt, growing hidden and increasingly unstable. Maxwell's companies were actually expanding faster than they could actually sustain. So, to maintain control, Robert Maxwell needed capital constantly. And that pressure right there would lead to basically one of the most controversial financial systems in modern British corporate history, like we were saying earlier. What was that? Well, they actually had a massive pension fund problem. To keep his empire afloat, money began moving in ways that it should not have, okay? Most critically really, was employee pension funds. These funds were actually supposed to be protected, if you will. Absolutely separate and untouchable. But investigators later found out that Robert Maxwell had used this money to stabilize his business quietly, without transparency, without public awareness. Now, this created a hidden financial structure that actually allowed the empire to continuing to function while it's actually collapsing internally, all right? So by the late 1980s, the system was actually considered unstable. Banks were very concerned. Accountants were uncertain. Internal pressure was actually rising. But publicly, the empire still looked powerful. Newspapers still ran. Deals were still happening. Influence was still flowing. But beneath the surface, it was already starting to break. So we have to look at something crucial to Robert Maxwell. All right. And that was the time he spent on his yacht at the end of his life. So November 1991. That would be in the Canary Islands. The yacht, Lady Ghislaine, which was named after his daughter, Ghislaine Maxwell, actually began to... let's start with this. Witnesses actually reported him aboard. Now, active presence, still conducting business. Then suddenly, Robert Maxwell was gone. There was no clear moment of disappearance. There was no consistent timeline. There really was just absence. Later, his body was found in the ocean. Now, the official ruling by the coroner was accidental drowning. You gotta understand, Robert Maxwell loved to swim. So, was it just drowning or was it something else? Was it an accident, suicide, or actually something else? The moment Robert Maxwell's body was recovered, the story stopped being about finance and it became something else entirely. A mystery. Because almost immediately, contradictions began to emerge. How did a man with full access to a yacht, his own yacht, disappear unnoticed? Why were there inconsistencies in all the crew's accounts? Why did official explanations vary in different tones across all of the early reporting? Three major theories began to emerge, okay? What are they? That would be accident. He may have fallen overboard due to his health issues, or distortion. Was it a suicide? Facing his financial collapse, exposure, and pressure, some people feel like he might have felt like it was easier to commit suicide and take his own life. The third, the one I believe in, assassination. The most controversial theory by far, but it's suggesting that intelligence, involvement, or silencing due to sensitive information that Robert Maxwell had. None of these theories have actually ever been proven, but none have actually fully disappeared either, just like the earlier ones, right? So let's look at what really made everything happen the way it did. Sorry. To understand Robert Maxwell, you really can't just look at what he did, okay? You have to understand that he became what he actually became psychologically, because everything in his life points back to one core trait. That one core trait is control. Not just control over money, not just control over media. Robert Maxwell wanted control over reality itself. Maxwell grew up in a world where control did not exist. Remember, it was a very war-torn area. Poverty removes control. War removes control. Genocide removes control. He experienced all three of those before adulthood. And that fact right there, folks, matters. Because survivors like that often develop one defining obsession. They will never be powerless again. Now, this becomes the invisible engine behind everything that Robert Maxwell actually builds. Okay? So how did he turn his life, all that trauma, and turn it into structure? Well, after surviving the chaos of the Holocaust, Robert Maxwell didn't just process trauma in a traditional way, okay? He structured it. He actually turned emotional chaos into a system. Systems, right? Of hierarchy, information, leverage, and dependency. He didn't just want success. That wasn't enough for Robert Maxwell. He wanted irrefutable stability. A world where nothing could ever happen to him or his family again. But paradoxically, the most controversial thing that he ever built, right? The more unstable that he became internally. Because listen, control, it requires constant maintenance. And maintenance, folks, requires what? Pressure. And pressure eventually becomes distortion. The need to be untouchable is something that he really had. So by the time that Robert Maxwell entered publishing, he wasn't just building a business, okay? He was trying to build immunity. Immunity from financial collapse, political vulnerability, social exposure, personal accountability. This is why the media matters so much to Robert Maxwell, because media doesn't just report reality. Media shapes reality. So whoever shapes the reality is harder to challenge. This is where his empire stops being like business and really starts to become psychological. Okay? So there really was, if you ask insiders, they said there was two different Robert Maxwells with what you would see. To the public, Robert Maxwell was energetic, had a visionary. He was powerful, he was successful. To employees, he was volatile, he was unpredictable. More importantly, he was intimidating. He was dominating. Now, these two versions of Robert Maxwell, these were not separate identities. These were strategic expressions that he had of control. He used charm upward, and he used fear downwards. The duality is common, really, in high control personalities operating in high stakes systems. But over time, the gap between those two selves widened, and instability begins to leak through. So let's look at for a second on the empire that he built. Robert Maxwell's companies did not grow organically in a healthy financial sense, okay? They actually expanded through aggressive acquisition, debt leverage, internal financing loops, right? Opaque financial movements. Now, at the center of this system was one consistent requirement: continuous inflow of capital. Listen, without it, the structure would really slow. And if it slowed, it would actually expose weakness. And Robert Maxwell could not allow weakness to appear. So, instead of slowing down, he decided to accelerate. And by accelerating, he entered a media war. Now, the British media landscape in the 1980s, this was not just competitive, folks. It really wasn't. It was brutal. It was territorial. And at the center of that battlefield, there were two massive men, Robert Maxwell and Rupert Murdoch. Now, Murdoch, he built his influence through expansion and political alignments, right? Robert Maxwell, he built influence through acquisition and pressure. Their rivalry, listen, it wasn't just a friendly business competition. It was actually ideological. Murdoch, he represented consolidation and long-term control. Robert Maxwell, he represented an aggressive expansion and centralized dominance. And behind every headline war, there really was something, if we're to be honest, deeper. A control over public narrative. Listen, control over political pressure and control over perception itself. That's what they both were really big about, controlling the perception. But there is a weakness that he had, which was debt acceleration. As Maxwell expanded, a critical problem actually grew underneath everything. Debt was compounding faster than his revenue. In the high leverage systems that really is the most dangerous point of all, right? Because debt doesn't just feel dangerous until confidence begins to break. So to prevent that break, Robert Maxwell, he needed liquidity constantly. And that requirement really shaped decisions that would later kind of define the Maxwell legacy. Eternal pressure and decision making. There was a lot of that. At the advanced stages of Maxwell's empire, decision making became reactive, really, instead of strategic, just reacting on the spot. Instead of asking, is this sustainable? The question for Robert Maxwell became, how do we keep this going? This shift is actually very crucial in understanding what happened next, okay? Because systems underneath immense pressure don't just collapse suddenly. They begin to bend reality internally first. Accounting becomes flexible. Boundaries become negotiable. Temporary solutions become permanent structures. And eventually, normal rules stop applying. So we heard earlier, we talked a little bit about how he dabbled into some pension fund problems, right? We're going to look a little bit deeper into that. So one of the most controversial aspects of Maxwell's empire actually involved employee pension funds. These funds were actually meant to be secure and independent of themselves and legally protected. But underneath the pressure that Robert Maxwell was facing, they became part of his eternal liquidity management. So, not officially described that way at the time, now, naturally, but functionally. And that is why they became money that actually moved through corporate layers. But between the subsidiaries, sorry, I can't say that word hardly, but across accounts that obscured visibility, this created a hidden buffer system, right? Which is when external funding actually tightened, internal funds filled the gap. Now, it kept that empire alive, but at a cost that would be only understood later. There was an illusion problem that he had. See, by the late 1980s, Robert Maxwell had become something very unusual. A structure that looked stable externally, but it required constant internal intervention to remain really functional. This is what makes the story of him so complex, because from the outside, newspapers were still being published. His companies were still being operated. Deals were still being closed. But internally, the pressure was rising. Liquidity was actually being very strained. Financial reality was actually deteriorating very fast. And very few people actually saw both sides of that at one time. So, as financial pressure actually began to increase, so did his personal intensity. See, Robert Maxwell became very controlling and more reactive on the spot, more dependent on direct oversight. This is often a late stage indicator in a collapsing system. Now, when trust disappears, control replaces it. But control cannot fix structure and balance. It can only delay the exposure. And delays always end in the same way, all at once. Approaching the breaking point, really, I would say, was by the early 1990s. I mean, the structure was no longer unstable. It was literally exposed to multiple different pressures simultaneously. What were they? The financial scrutiny, banking concerns, internal suspicion, and media investigations. And Robert Maxwell was now operating inside a very narrowing space where every single move carried massive risk. And in systems like this, the financial phase is often not a slow decline. However, it is a rapid loss of control. I want to look a little bit more into Robert Maxwell's last days. So by the late 1991, Robert Maxwell basically was under extreme pressure. So on the surface, he looked like a media titan, right? That's the way he made himself appear everywhere. But behind the scenes, his empire was tightening around him. Banks were asking harder questions. Journalists were circling around. Internal finances were becoming increasingly difficult to mask. A confidence inside the organization was starting to fracture. He was no longer expanding. He was managing by mere survival. At this stage of his life, Maxwell was frequently aboard his luxury yacht, the Lady Ghislaine, which, yes, was named after his daughter, Ghislaine Maxwell. That was his escape. He was on that boat all the time. It wasn't just a vessel for travel. It functioned, really, as a private office, a retreat from scrutiny, and, according to a lot of accounts, a floating command center for Robert Maxwell, for basically all his business dealings. Where did he die? Let's look into that a little bit. That was the Canary Islands back again in November 1991. So in early November 1991, Robert Maxwell actually set sail near the Canary Islands. He loved that place, off the northwest coast of Africa. Now, the journey was routine on paper, but those close to the situation later described the atmosphere of unusual tension. Maxwell had been making late night calls. He was having meetings privately with very selected aides and appearing increasingly preoccupied with financial matters all the time. So in hindsight, this period is often described as his final stretch of psychological and financial pressure that was covering him all at once, meaning it was starting to get to the point to where he couldn't just hide it anymore. So on the morning of November 5th, 1991, Robert Maxwell was reported missing from his yacht. Now the ship was still at sea, but Maxwell himself was gone. A search began almost immediately. Hours later, his body was recovered, floating in the Atlantic Ocean. Now the official ruling came quickly. What was that? Naturally, it almost always is this: accidental drowning. No confirmed evidence of a struggle was actually found. No definitive sign of foul play was established. But the speed of that conclusion, folks, would honestly become one of the most controversial aspects of the case of Robert Maxwell. Immediately, questions started. From the moment the announcement was made, speculation about his death began. Robert Maxwell's situation, you got to understand, it was not simple. He was deeply in debt, under increasing financial scrutiny, tied to multiple internal investigations, and he was facing potential exposure of a large-scale irregularities in his companies. Now, this led to competing theories. One, an accidental death. That was the official explanation that we keep going over. Simple fall overboard during the nighttime. A suicide. Some people believe that Maxwell was overwhelmed by the pressure that he was facing in public, knowing that he chose to end his life. Foul play, that's the one I think, which is others suggested a more complex possibility. Financial retaliation, intelligence involvement, or eternal silencing, connected to sensitive information that he definitely had. None of these theories actually were ever proven, and none have actually been universally accepted by everybody. You know, it's interesting because with Robert Maxwell, his burial, even his death burial, sparks controversy. After his body was recovered, Robert Maxwell was returned for burial in Israel. He was laid to rest at the Mount of Olives, a cemetery in Jerusalem that is one of the most historically significant and important burial sites in the world. Why is that? Well, the Mount of Olives Cemetery, that funeral carried a level of official recognition that really surprised many of the people that was there watching it. Israeli dignitaries attended, including high-level political figures of the time. Now, one of the most noted attendees was actually Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir. Now, Yitzhak, this pressure fueled immediate speculation. Because listen, state level acknowledgement at a funeral of a controversial media figure, well, that's not very common. It raised questions that honestly still circulate today. What relationships did Robert Maxwell truly maintain at a state level? How deep were his political and institutional connections? And why was his death treated with such formal recognition from a world government like Israel? There's so many of these theories around his death. His death did not close his story. Listen, it actually expanded it. Because what died in 1991 was not just a man. It was a financial structure, right? It was a media network, and it was a web of unresolved questions. Within months of his death, financial irregularities were exposed, pension funds were misused, allegations surfaced, and his corporate empire collapsed underneath investigation. So, what had been held together by one central figure, it literally no longer had a stabilizing force behind it. And it fell apart quickly. But there is a beginning of another chapter of the Maxwells. And perhaps the most significant consequence of Robert Maxwell's death was not financial, folks. It was actually very personal. Because listen, his daughter, Ghislaine Maxwell, would later become connected to one of the most notorious criminal scandals in modern history, involving international financier Jeffrey Epstein. Now, Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein, they're an interesting story on their own. And this is where the Maxwell story kind of stops only being about Robert Maxwell and begins to echo into something far more larger. So after his death, right? What happened? When Robert Maxwell died in November 1991, there was an immediate assumption in some circles, right, that his companies would continue operating as normal. But listen, that assumption, that was wrong. Because Robert Maxwell, he wasn't just the owner of an empire. He was the central stabilizing mechanism inside that empire. His companies were not structured like independent corporate companies were. His companies, well, they function more like a single interconnected financial organism. And when the controlling mind started to disappear, that system did not just adjust. It destabilized. Let's look at the first crack. What was that? Well, that would be liquidity failure. Within days of his death, financial partners began to reassessing exposure. Banks had previously extended credit, paused lending, required immediate audits, tightened repayment demands. Because now there was no longer a dominant negotiator. There is no pressure, no pressure figure. No one managed the perception of what the companies were doing. And in leveraged systems, perception often becomes the difference between survival and the system collapsing. So, as the accountants and the brothers, like Ghislaine Maxwell's brothers, and the investigators began reviewing the internal structures, they actually found something a lot of people would consider critical. The financial architecture was actually extremely complex. Not just complex in size like most would assume, but complex in its traceability. Funds were moved through subsidiaries, holding companies' internal accounts and company transfers. This made it difficult to actually immediately determine what money belonged and to whom it belonged to, what assets were real, what liabilities were actually being hidden or offset. And look, in simple terms, the system had been designed in a way that required constant eternal control to remain understandable. And that control was gone. So we've talked about this pension fund exposure. We're going to a little bit more again. One of the most serious revelations actually involved employee pension funds that was tied to the Mirror Group newspapers. Mirror Group newspapers, look, these pension funds, like I said earlier, were actually intended to be, I can't emphasize this enough, legally protected, separately managed, and reserved for employee retirement security, meaning they're not supposed to be touched. But investigations began revealing something far more complicated. Funds had been moved between accounts within the corporate structure, right? Not necessarily labeled in a transparent way. And not really isolated from business operations either. This result was actually a massive growing concern. What was that? That concern was that long-term employee savings had been used to support short-term corporate liquidating, meaning liquidating the company. Now, this is one of the most sensitive types of financial exposure that a company can actually face, because it actually transforms a corporate collapse into a public trust collapse. Once the public loses trust in you, you're going to fail. So, as forensic accounting actually expanded, estimates of missing or misallocated money funds actually began to really rise. So, early figures, they were kind of uncertain. But they eventually reached hundreds of millions of pounds. Different reports placed the estimates in the range of, get this, 300 million pounds, 400 million pounds, and in some analyses, even higher, depending on the classification methods that were used. But the key was not just the number. It was actually the structure, because investigators were not just tracking losses. They were actually reconstructing a financial system that had been continuously rebalanced under pressure over a period of years, which ultimately did cause the collapse of confidence. Once pension fund irregularities actually became public, confidence started to collapse rapidly, right? Now, this is a critical point in a corporate failure, and here's those dynamics. Once trust breaks, even healthy assets will lose perceived value. Banks stop extending credit to you. Investors will begin to pull back. Partners will distance themselves. And internally, employees really were facing a reality that they were not fully aware of. That their retirement security was tied to a company that was under investigation for financial mismanagement. That emotional impact was as significant, really, as the financial one, believe me. So, what happened then? I mean, you're going to have a role of a leadership vacuum happen. So, after Robert Maxwell's death, no successor had actually equivalent to authority or influence. His sons briefly attempted to have involvement, but they did not have Robert Maxwell's control over negotiations, his network influence, or Robert Maxwell's ability to stabilize external pressure. This fact created a massive vacuum. And in a complex systems, vacuums, believe me folks, they're very dangerous, because pressure does not disappear. The vacuum means it redistributes. And in this case, it redistributed into regulatory agencies, creditors, and legal systems. Regulatory and legal responses. As the scale of financial irregularities became clearer, authorities, they began formal investigations. Now, this included accounting reviews, asset tracing, and examination of internal transfers. What investigators were actually attempting to do, really, was to reconstruct, okay? What did this empire actually look like in a financial reality? Not what Robert Maxwell made it appear to be, but what it functionally actually was. And that distinction became increasingly important because appearance and structure were not aligned at all. So let's look at the unwinding of his corporation. So as the pressure increased, the empire began breaking apart. The subsidiaries were sold, assets were liquidated, operations were separated, and reconstructing attempts were initiated. But at this stage, the system was no longer growing or stabilizing. It was actually unwinding. And unwinding is rarely orderly. Each asset sale exposed more complexity. Each audit revealed more dependency loops. Each restructuring attempt uncovered deeper structural entanglement. Was there any psychological aftershock? Yes, there was. Inside the media world, Maxwell's collapse changed. Perception dramatically changed, all right? He had been seen as powerful, untouchable, strategically dominant. But now he was actually being redefined as over-leveraged, structurally unstable, and potentially financially opaque. This shift matters because reputation in media industries directly impacts a couple things. What does that impact? Political influence, negotiational power, and institutional trust. And once that perception changes, it rarely ever returns to its original state. So one could say it was the end of the Maxwell system. By the 1990s, what remained of Maxwell's empire had been significantly dismantled. What once actually functioned as a unified media financial structure was now actually a collection of fragmented assets. But the most lasting impact was not just corporate, folks. It was institutional. Because listen, the collapse, it forced a couple things. Regulatory scrutiny, their improvements, pension funds, the oversight changes, and deeper examination of media ownership structures. So in other words, the system changed after the system already broke. So all that remained was a shadow. So even after the liquidation and all the investigation, there were still questions that, like I keep saying, did not fully disappear. There's some that still are out there today because Robert Maxwell's life contained unresolved tensions, intelligence rumors, financial paucity, political proximity, and sudden death underneath pressure, a mysterious death. But what is certain is this. He built a system that required constant control to function. And when that control disappeared, the system revealed its true form. Okay? I really want to focus on something. Everybody brings up the intelligence factor. So after Robert Maxwell's death, one of the categories of discussion that really never fully disappeared, I mean, they're still talking about it today. It wasn't his finances, which at his lifetime he was known for, not his publishing empire he was known for. It was something far more controversial. His alleged connections to intelligence services. It's important to state clearly at this beginning, okay? I want you guys to understand this. There is no publicly verified evidence that Robert Maxwell was formerly an agent of any intelligence agency. However, there are persistent claims that are circumstantial. His associations and historical context that really keeps this theory kind of alive in public discussion. So we break into this next three layers, okay? Let's look at confirmed historical context, documented associations, speculative intelligence theories. So, what was confirmed? Why intelligence was even a possibility? Well, to understand why these rumors exist at all, you have to understand the error that Robert Maxwell actually operated in. Post-World War II Europe was heavily influenced by intelligence reconstruction networks, okay? Look into that one. Cold War espionage structures and cooperation between military officers and intelligence agencies. Now, Robert Maxwell himself served in the British military during World War II, like we discussed earlier. He was commissioned into the British Army, and he worked in roles that involved some interesting things. Communications, coordination, and operational military environments. Think about those three things. Now, during wartime Europe, it was not unusual for military officers to interact with intelligence personnel. But interaction does not automatically equal recruitment. Still, this wartime environment is where later speculation begins. See, documented associations that there are, like the gray zone. See, after the war, Robert Maxwell moved into publishing and international business. This basically placed him in a unique position. That unique position was he controlled large flows of scientific, political, and international information. Publishing, especially scientific publishing, often that would intersect with government research, defense-related science, and international academic exchanges. Now, that overlap created proximity to very sensitive information ecosystems to strive. But again, proximity is not evidence of operational intelligence involvement. However, some journalists and authorities and authors have pointed out that Robert Maxwell, he really had access to high-level political figures. He moved in elite international circles and maintained relationships across multiple world governments. Now, this is where the speculation begins to emerge. There is a ton of Mossad allegations. One of the most persistent claims actually involves the Israeli intelligence agency, the infamous Mossad. Some writers and commentaries have suggested that Maxwell may have facilitated contacts between different governments, acted as an informal intermediate, or assisted in information exchange through different business networks. Now, a frequently cited example in discussions actually involve Israeli nuclear whistleblower Mordechai Vanunu. Now, this guy actually exposed details about Israel's nuclear program back in the 1980s. Now, Vanunu was later abducted, and he was taken into Israel in a covert operation that was actually widely attributed to Israeli intelligence. Now, some speculative accounts suggest that Robert Maxwell may have indirect involvement in identifying or facilitating intelligence awareness of Vanunu's activities. However, again, there is no publicly confirmed evidence directly linking Maxwell to Vanunu's capture or his exposure. This remains in the realm of allegations and speculations. So we got to look into naturally the MI6 and CIA, right? So beyond Mossad, other intelligence agencies are sometimes mentioned with the Maxwells. In really secondary literature, MI6, CIA, these claims generally stem from Maxwell's British military background, his political career as a member of parliament, and his international business dealings. The argument made by some of the theorist is a figure operating at Robert Maxwell's level of media ownership, right, and political access, it would naturally attract intelligence interest, yeah? Either as a contact asset or a subject of monitoring. But again, this is interpretation, not verified fact. No classification document has actually confirmed operational recruitment or formal agency status. But you really do got to look into the intelligence logic, because these theories, they just won't go away. Even without proof, intelligence theories persist around Maxwell for structural reasons. Access. He had contact with powerful political financial figures, right? The second factor, information flow. He literally controlled major publishing networks and scientific journalists. The third factor, political proximity. He served in the British Parliament and interacted with government structures. Cold War context. The era he operated in was defined by intelligence competition. When you combine those four elements, you create a profile that is compatible with intelligence interests, right? Even if evidence of intelligence rolls, like if there's not evidence of intelligence rolls. But there is a missing link problem. The central issue in all intelligence theories about Robert Maxwell is this following thing. There is no confirmed operational chain. There goes that thing, no confirmed. Meaning, no verified recruitment records, no declassified confirmation, no confirmed handler relationships, no authentic intelligence documentation. Sorry about that. What remains instead is a normal thing. Circumstantial overlap, retrospective interpretation, and narrative reconstruction. This is why historians and journalists remain so divided. Now, what is most likely to happen is actually based on available evidence that we have, all right? That based evidence really, I guess, would be the most grounded interpretation. That is this. Robert Maxwell was a powerful media mogul, a political connected businessman, a figure with an access to elite networks, and someone operating in a world where intelligence services were active and very pervasive. But there is no confirmed proof that he was formally recruited or operationally directed or officially embedded in any kind of intelligence work. So the most accurate classification, right? It's one of my favorite ones in intelligence work. A high access civilian whose environment actually overlaps with intelligence activities. Not a confirmed intelligence agency, okay? You got to understand there's a difference between those two things. But however, why do the rumors still persist? They never really die, right? Even after investigations, financial collapse, and his death, the intelligence theories, they persist because Robert Maxwell represents a specific type of figure. Powerful and globally connected and operating across political and financial systems across the globe. Not one or two, many different ones. And listen, historical figures like that often become the subject of intelligence speculation, whether it's true or not. So there is something that we're going to look into again. By 1991, Robert Maxwell's business empire no longer was in expansion mode. It was actually in maintenance, under pressure. Now, on the surface, everything Robert Maxwell made it look still very much operational. Newspapers were still being published. The corporate money was still functioning. Deals were still being negotiated, as I said earlier. But internally, as we discussed, there were massive problems. Now, His company was now operating in a state of constant financial balancing underneath immense stress. The key pressure points were rising debt, exposure, tightening bank confidence, increasing internal cash dependency, and growing external scrutiny. Now, this is the type of financial environment that immediately preceding collapse. That's what it was. That's the type of environment. So in 1991, banking pressure actually began to tighten, right? In early 1991, financial institutions began reassessing exposure to Robert Maxwell and his linked companies. Now, this typically actually happens in different stages. The stage one was a quiet review. That's where banks eternally reassess risk profiles. The second stage, reduced flexibility. Credit terms become stricter. The third stage, a direct inquiry. Requests transparency to increase. So by this stage, Maxwell's empire was already dependent on continuous liquidation movement. So even small tightening created structural strain. By 1991, internal financial strains actually began to intensify. As the year progressed, internal financial pressure massively increased. You're talking very significantly. At this stage, the system shows classic stress indicators. What are they? Delayed payments across the subsidiaries, the increased internal transfers between entities, the reliance on short-term liquidity solutions, and heightened internal financial management activity. Now, this is where corporate systems often begin to shape form. So strategic finance, right, versus survival finance. See, in survival finance is unstable by the very definition. Late summer 1991, liquidation, dependency, and the peaks of it all. So by that late summer, Robert Maxwell's companies were increasingly dependent on rapid liquidation cycles. And look, in simple terms, money had to keep basically moving. If movement slowed down, the obligations would not be met. Confidence would drop, and external partners would begin to react. So this creates a fragile equilibrium, the system that works only while it keeps moving fast enough to move. But fast moving systems, listen, are very hard to stabilize. So in autumn of 1981, intensifying external scrutiny began to grow to the point to where by autumn, it increased from multiple directions. Financial institutions, auditors, journalists, and eternal corporate stakeholders. This is a critical phase, really, in collapse of the timelines, because once external scrutiny increases, internal flexibility decreases. And once flexibility decreases, systems become reactive instead of controlled. Okay? Early November of 1991, as we discussed earlier, why did we discuss them so much? Because that was considered the final days of them. So in the days of leading up to Robert Maxwell's death, he was aboard his famous yacht, the Lady Ghislaine. This thing was reportedly massive. Now, this period is actually consistently described by many people as highly active, operational focus, and marked by business communications, primarily only. Robert Maxwell was still engaging with financial matters while he was at sea in the ocean. This suggests that the empire was still being actively managed up to the final days, but pressure was at its peak. November 4th of 1991 was known as the last day. That is widely treated as the last full day that Robert Maxwell was actually definitely accounted for. See, during this phase, communications were ongoing. The crew activity was considered normal, and public indication of crisis was visibly on board. From a forensic perspective, this is actually considered important. There is no confirmed public breakdown of events immediately preceding his disappearance. This makes the transition into the next phase abrupt and in public terms. So, his disappearance on that morning of November 5th in 1991 is still one of the most controversial. Robert Maxwell was reported missing from that yacht that day. Now, as the search actually began, immediately shortly after his body was recovered from the Atlantic Ocean, there was an official conclusion: accidental drowning. However, from a forensic timeline, perceptive key questions begin to arise. Exact time of fall kind of remains unclear. The last confirmed sighting window is very narrow. Onboard activity logs were not fully publicly detailed. This leaves a compressed investigative window. So, what happened after the body discovery? Well, after the recovery, authorities conducted initial examinations. Maritime assessments were reviewed, naturally, and preliminary conclusions were issued really quickly. The rapid classification was accidental death because a defining point of controversy, and it stays that way, because in high-profile cases, speedy conclusion often increases public skepticism. So listen. For the first 72 hours, a narrative formation it started to begin, right? Within the first 3 days after his death, some things happened. 3 competing narratives begin to form. Accidental death. Official maritime interpretation was that. Suicide. A lot of people think that he committed suicide because he was facing so much financial and psychological pressure. Foul play. That's the one I drive towards. This is driven by financial exposure and geopolitical speculation. But more importantly, none of these narratives had fully evidentiary confirmation at that stage. They were just interpretations of a limited initial data, right? So later, financial systems began reacting. Within 1 week, banks began reassessing exposure. Corporate continuity questions actually started to emerge, and internal management instability really increased. This marks a key transition. Okay, and that's where the story stops being about Robert Maxwell's death and actually becomes about system survivability, because after the loss and control center of his company, 2 to 4 weeks, structural breakdown really begins within weeks. That is, internal audits really intensified. Liquidation gaps became very visible, and corporate dependencies were being exposed. At that stage, investigations began identifying some things. Not isolated irregularities either, but system-wide structural financial complexities. This is where Robert Maxwell's collapse becomes visibly external. So, the infamous year 1991 and 1992, by the end of 1991 and into 1992, financial irregularities were formally examined, right? Pension fund concerns really began to emerge publicly, and corporate reconstruction discussions began. This is the phase where hidden internal systems become external legal problems. And once that begins to happen, some other things happen. The system cannot return to its previous form. And there is a final stage. That final stage is breakdown into assets. Eventually, the empire transitions into asset liquidation, restructuring, and fragmentation into basically separate entities. Now, what once functioned as a unified structure, it became a collection of disconnected financial pieces. This is the financial stage of collapse, transformation from empire, right? A state investigation. There is another theory called the mirror system. That's understanding the structural parallels. When investigator journalists and researchers started studying the complex public scandals, if you will, they often noticed something. This is something important. It is rarely about one person. It is about systems that behave in similar ways underneath pressure. This is where the idea of a mirror system really comes in effect. See, a mirror system does not mean two cases are identical. It means that they share structural behaviors, pressure dynamics, and dependency patterns, and ultimately collapse signatures. So, in that analysis, we compare two systems often discussed in public discourse, right? That would be the Robert Maxwell media financial empire and the Jeffrey Epstein social financial network. But we are not claiming equivalence. We are not examining pattern resemblance in system behavior. System types, right? What are they? The centralized media financial empire, Robert Maxwell. The Maxwell structure can be described as a vertical centralized corporate media. Really a corporate media system. A key characteristics, what are they? One is a central authority node, right? Robert Maxwell functioned as their primary decision center, literally. The second part to that is financial interdependency. Multiple companies relied internally on liquidity flow. The third step, reputation-driven stability. External confidence supported internal solvency. But wait, there is more. Information control layer. Media ownership influence perception and narrative framing. Look, this type of system depends heavily on continuous confidence and continuous liquidity and centralized control. Again, liquidity means moving. When any of these breaks, the system destabilizes quickly. So what are the system types? So the second system type is a network-based social financial structure, i.e. Epstein. The Epstein-linked ecosystem is often described in public reporting as a decentralized network of social financial connections, right? So there is a key characteristics here to look at. One is the distributive connectivity. No single public corporate empire of equivalent scale. The second one would be relationship-based, naturally. Relationship-based access. Influence operates through interpersonal proximity to one another. The third would be private financial channels. Now, wealth movement is less publicly structured in this way. The fourth is reputation shielding. Social status and connection reduces scrutiny for long periods. This system depends on access continuity and secrecy protection, plus network insulation and a lot of insulation. So when exposure occurs, the system destabilizes rapidly due to visibility. So shared structural feature dependency on the hidden stability. So despite the differences, both systems share a critical similarity to one another. They rely on hidden mechanisms that are not really fully visible to external observers or watchers. So in Robert Maxwell's case, eternal financial transfers, right? Eternal company dependencies, liquidity structures. And in the Epstein related discussions, you have private networks, undisclosed relationships, limited transparency in financial flows. But in both cases, external perception did not fully reflect internal structure. And that gap is where stability often forms. The role of central figures, another shared structural pattern, is important in this central node. See, in Maxwell's system, Robert Maxwell, he was a stabilizing authority, the decision and the pressure management flow, and that flowed through him. However, in Jeffrey Epstein's related discussions, what you're going to find is Jeffrey Epstein often described a central connector node, though in a different structural form. So the key comparison is not role similarity here. It's actually dependency concentration. See, when too much function depends on a central point, the system becomes vulnerable to sudden disruption. So information control versus information exposure. What is that? A major structural difference between the two systems is how information behaves. See, Robert Maxwell's system, information was controlled through media ownership, narratives that could be shaped externally, visibility that really could be managed through publishing, influence that he had. However, in Jeffrey Epstein's system, it was often described as public discourse, information fragmented across personal accounts. Exposures often comes from investigation or investigative reporting. Narrative control is weaker and actually more decentralized. So, we see two opposite strategies here. Control of information flow versus contain information exposure. Both aim at stability, but through different mechanisms. See, collapse dynamics and how each system actually fails is actually interesting. This is where structural analysis becomes most important, because both systems actually demonstrate a similar collapse pattern. Those collapse patterns are rapid destabilization after a loss of a central control or exposure to threshold. Robert Maxwell's pattern was financial pressure that built internally. Confidence internally weakens externally. Central stabilizer disappears. Systems will rapidly unravel. Jeffrey Epstein's related pattern was structural discussions only. Network exposure increases. Reputational shielding weakness. Legal and investigative pressure rises. So network relationships fragmented under scrutiny. So in both cases, once stabilization mechanisms actually fail, collapse and accelerates rather than slowly, decays. But we want to look at why these systems actually get compared. See, the reason these two cases are often discussed together is not because they are identical. It is because they both involve some similar things: elite access environments, financial complexity, information asymmetry, and delayed visibility of eternal structures. What that does is it creates what analysts sometimes call late visibility systems. I actually like that one. Meaning the public only sees the structure clearly when it's already destabilizing. So the critical misunderstanding is critical. A common mistake in public interpretation is assuming similarity in structure equals similarity in intent or coordination. But structurally, similar systems can emerge independently. Similar pressures produce similar adaptations, and similar environments generate similar survival strategies. So, what looks like coordination may actually be convergence underneath comparable systems, systematic conditions. And we're going to look at some other things real quick, okay? If we strip away speculation and focus only on systems, the system analysts, we are left with 3 conclusions. 1, centralized systems, Robert Maxwell's type, depend on eternal control and financial continuity. The second one, network systems, that would be Jeffrey Epstein's type. That depends on insulation and relational access. Both systems fail when visibility increases, trust collapses, or central stability is removed. But critically, similar collapse of pattern does not prove shared origin or shared connection. It only shows how complex systems behave under pressure. So elite power structures. We're going to look into that a little bit because you have to when you're talking about Robert Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein. When analysts study figures like Robert Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein, the most useful lens is not their personality. It is an environmental structure, because both actually operated inside overlapping elite ecosystems, which were made up of finance, politics, media, academia, and high-trust social networks. These systems are not centralized. They are interconnected, layers of influence. And influence, folks, flows through them like pressure pipes, honestly. So let's look at some of these layers, right? Layer 1, finance, is an infrastructure. At that base of elite systems is finance, but not just wealth, but capital movement architecture. This right here, folks, includes banks, investment firms, private equity, credit structures, offshore entities. Offshore entities is crucial. In both Maxwell era and Epstein era discussions, finance is not just an outcome. Finance, it is its operating medium, because without financial access, relationships will do what? Weaken. Institutions disengage, and influence will start to decay. So finance functions like oxygen in that system. Layer 2 is media as narrative control. That's the next layer, and that is crucial. Media, not just journalism, but narrative distribution power. In Maxwell's case, this was direct. Ownership of publishing groups, control over editorial direction, influence over political messaging. Listen, this created a feedback loop that was really financial power, media influence, which offered political leverage, and ultimately more financial access. In a modern systems, media is more fragmented, right? Traditional outlets, digital platforms, independent creators, right, like ourselves, algorithm-driven distribution. But the core function remains the same. Shaping perception of reality at scale. There is a third layer, which is political access networks. The third layer is political proximity. This does not mean direct control of government. However, it does mean repeated access to decision makers and institutions. How many times did you see them visiting the White House? In elite ecosystems, political access functions as regulatory influence, political proximity, reputational validation, and crisis insulation. Robert Maxwell had documented political proximity through his parliamentary role that he had when he worked at for the parliament. Now, in broader Jeffrey Epstein related discussions, political proximity is described in terms of association networks, right? That's rather than formal office. Roberts is formal office more. But structural, the functions actually function very similar. Access reduces friction between private power and public institutions. So, is there another layer? Why, yes, there is. Layer 4. Academia and knowledge institutions. Look, another overlooked layer, an important layer, is academia and research ecosystems. These institutions provide legitimacy, intellectual credibility, and scientific authority. Robert Maxwell's publishing empire intersected directly with scientific and educational journals and academic distribution, including school textbooks. Now, this placed him in research pipelines, scientific disinformation, and institutional knowledge networks. So in elite systems, academia is not just education like it is for us simple folks. It is validation infrastructure. The fifth layer is what we call social networks of trust. Now, at that top level sets the most important layer of all. Informal trust networks. These actually include personal introductions, social events, private gatherings, reputational endorsements. This layer is actually powerful because it is not a formalized layer. It actually operates solely on trust, familiarity, and perceived legitimacy. And in high-level environments, trust often precedes verification. This is where many elite systems actually become resilient. Okay? How layers interact. These layers, they do not operate independently. They actually reinforce each other. Finance enables access. Access enables influence, and influence strengthens media position. But the media strengthens reputation. Reputation increases financial opportunities. Now, this creates a closed reinforcement loop of elite stability. Rewind that and listen to that again. But the same structure also creates risk. If one layer fails, others begin to destabilize in sequence. So was there instability? You know there was. The instability does not usually begin at the top, though. It begins when financial pressure increases, scrutiny begins to intensify, or trust weakens across one layer. Then the system responds by increasing insulation, tightening access, and relying more heavily on remaining stable layers. This is why collapse can appear sudden, because internally composition is already really happening, and often for a really long time. The visibility delay. Why do they see the collapse late? Well, one of the most important structural characteristics of an elite ecosystem is delayed external visibility. Internally, the pressures may actually exist for years. Adjustments may actually be constant. Instability may be managed continuously. But externally, everything actually appears stable until thresholds are crossed. Then, multiple failures will appear at once. This creates the perception of sudden collapse. Even when the process was gradual internally, important distinction structures. Let's look at that versus intent. So at this point, an analyst is critical to separate two ideas. Structural observation, right? Systems behave similar underneath pressure. Elite ecosystems share overlapping layers. Collapse patterns can look alike. Casual claims, assuming shared intent, assuming coordination, assuming unified hidden control. Only the first category is supported by systematic analysts. The second requires evidence that is not publicly established. So what the Robert Maxwell case actually demonstrates is that Robert Maxwell's system, I guess what it illustrates, is how financial complexity can exceed oversight capacity, how media ownership actually amplifies both powers and risk, how dependency on central figures creates what? Fragility, and how collapse actually accelerates when the center, or when that center is removed. So it is a case study in centralized systems, vulnerability underneath financial and reputational pressure. Now, what the Jeffrey Epstein's discussion actually illustrated, structurally speaking, was without making claims about coordination or intent. See, the Jeffrey Epstein's related discourse, it illustrated how networks-based systems operate. Like, operate through access rather than ownership. How reputation shielding can delay scrutiny. How fragmentation complicates oversight. And how exposure can rapidly destabilize or interconnected relationships. Look, it is a case study in decentralized network vulnerability under exposure pressure. So, what could we draw from all this, kind of like these two different system types, right? When compared structurally, Robert Maxwell's type of systems was decentralized control, hierarchy control, financial interdependence, collapse via internal failure. But what about the network type of systems? Distributed connections, relatable structures, social insulation, collapse via exposure cascade. Both are stable underneath low pressure. Both are fragile underneath high pressure. But they fell in different ways. Okay? Now, we can't do all this without looking at Ghislaine Maxwell. As I said earlier, to understand Ghislaine Maxwell, you cannot start in her adult years. You have to start in structure, because she was not simply an isolated figure entering an elite society. See, she was actually shaped inside a very specific type of environment. A high pressure, high status, high controlled household built around Robert Maxwell. This fact matters because children raised in such systems often adapt to hierarchy rather than equality, performance rather than authenticity, access rather than independency, and control-based social navigation. In other words, they learn that survival depends on understanding power, not resisting it. The household environment really, like inside the Robert Maxwell's household, it was not just a parent, okay? Because he wasn't just a parent. He was an institution, a figure associated with authority, unpredictability, high expectations, I mean very high expectations, in constant motion. In systems like this, the home environment becomes less about comfort and more about your status management and behavioral adaptations to that status management. Children in such environments, they often learn attention must be earned, not just assumed, and proximity to power is itself a form of true value. This creates a psychological foundation centered on external validation structures, right? Now, identity, developmental, underneath like high authority figures, developmentally, when a child is raised underneath a really dominant parental figure like Robert Maxwell, several adaptations can occur. That first one is observational learning. See, instead of being told how power works, it is observed directly by the child. Number two, social calibration. So learning how to behave in elite or high status environments at a very early age. The step number three, emotional compression. See, reducing visible emotional expression in favor of adaptability, being able to adapt. These are not abnormalities. These are adaptive responses to environment. But let's look at the transition. You know what I mean? The exposure, if you will, to elite networks. So as Ghislaine Maxwell matured, she was actually exposed to environments that extended beyond the household, you know? Political circles, business elite, media environments, international social networks. This type of exposure, that creates a unique developmental pattern. Social normalization of elite proximity, meaning what feels exclusive to most people, it becomes standard environment to that individual. This shift, that perception of boundaries, not necessarily in a conscious way, meaning you know what you're doing, but in a behavioral familiarity way. That death was not easy on Ghislaine. So, after Robert Maxwell's death in 1991, the Maxwell family entered into a period of financial instability, public scrutiny, reputational reassessment. Listen, for Ghislaine Maxwell, this represents a major structural shift from the daughter of a dominant media figure to a descendant of a collapsed public empire. This type of transition often produces one of the two adaptive responses. The first one would be withdrawal and separation from legacy systems, meaning not want no part of a legacy system. Number two, re-entry into similar environments through alternative pathways. So, in Ghislaine's case, the documented tragedy indicates continued movement within the social ecosystems. Now, social navigation, what skills did she actually learn in this? Like living like that? Well, across many accounts and analysts, one consistent characteristic is attributed to Ghislaine Maxwell. And I don't think it's going to surprise many people. So a high-level social navigation ability in system terms, this means an ability to read hierarchy very quickly, understanding informal power structures very quickly, adapting behavior to context, and maintaining access across different social layers, meaning different types of people. This is not inherently negative and also not positive. It is, however, a functional skill set in a high access environments that you're raised in. But naturally, you're going to have to look at the economy of what she comes from. So the elite social environments, they often operate with what could be described as an access economy. What is that? In this structure, proximity equals opportunity. Trust is built through reputation. Introductions, they carry massive value, and your reputation functions as your currency. You're only as good as your reputation in those systems. Individuals who excel in these environments are often those who can maintain continuity of access across shifting social clusters and social situations. This is a key concept for understanding how networks persist over time. So structural continuity versus personal, I can't even say that word, so I'm not even going to say that. So at this stage, it is important to distinguish again. We are not saying inherited intent, inherited purpose, or predetermined outcomes. Sorry about that. We are describing an environmental continuing patterns. Meaning, when someone raised inside a specific system, they often become highly adapted to operating within similar systems later in life. This is a structural observation, not a moral conclusion. So then in that case, why did Ghislaine become the central figure? Well, Ghislaine Maxwell later became widely discussed in connection with Jeffrey Epstein. Think about it. She wasn't really discussed much before then. Jeffrey Epstein, from a systems perspective, right? What made her significant in public discussions was not just her association. It wasn't. It was a continuity of the environment, right? Which was what? Elite access networks, high trust social circles, and long duration proximity to very influential individuals. These are the same structural layers that were discussed in my earlier episodes that dealt with finance, social access, and reputation networks. Now, important analytical boundaries to look at here. It is essential to state clearly public legal findings regarding individuals must be treated separately from structural analysts of systems. See, system analyst explains environments. Legal findings determine accountability. These are not interchangeable. This series that I'm doing focuses on how elite access systems function structurally over time. Not on assigning unverified intent or hidden coordinations. But when we step back, right, the reoccurring pattern across Robert Maxwell's elite systems and later networks, such as early exposure power structures, right? Adaptation to high access environments. Development of social navigation skills. Long-term movements within elite ecosystems. This pattern appears in multiple historical contexts across numerous industries, which is why it became analytically interesting to people. So, let's look at something. Do systems inherently create morality? No. I think our most important conclusion really could be systems reproduce structure, not intent. Meaning, environment shaped behavior patterns, right? Access systems reward certain skills, and continuity occurs through adaptation, not inheritance. This is why similar patterns can actually appear across different eras and numerous different individuals. See, there is a myth of sudden collapse here. When high-profile systems fail, the public often describes it as it all just fell apart overnight. But in structural reality, collapse is almost never sudden. It only appears sudden when you're on the outside looking inward. See, internally, it is usually a long compression of pressure that eventually crosses a visibility threshold. So what people call sudden collapse is usually delayed recognition followed by rapid exposure, followed by fast institutional responses. There is some phases we're going to look at. Phase 1, okay, hidden accumulation. Every complex system begins with stability through what? Expansion. Financial growth, network expansion, institutional trust, and reputational reinforcement. But over time, complexity introduces friction, dependency, and increased oversight decreases family scale, and internal visibility becomes harder to maintain. This creates the first silent phase, right? The accumulation of internal pressure without external visibility. What is the second phase, right? We got to have one. That's called decomposition behavior. When pressure builds inside a system, it does not immediately break, does it? It actually will begin to compensate. Common compensations, it would include increased financial layering, tighter internal control, reliance on trusted intermediaries, and faster decision cycles. To outsiders looking in, this still looks like stability, but it's not stable. See, but structurally, it is active resistance against internal imbalance. This phase can last, folks, years, sometimes decades. Now, the third one of these to look at would be dependency lock-in. Now, at a certain point, systems become very dependent on their own complexity. What am I saying? What I'm meaning is operations cannot slow down. Financial flows must continue. Reputation must be maintained at all times. And internal trust must hold together. This creates a condition, right, that is called structural dependency lock-in. So in this state, stopping activity becomes more dangerous than continuing. So the system actually accelerates even underneath massive stress. What is phase 4? Phase 4 is known as external pressure. The collapse usually begins when external forces align. Financial scrutiny will increase, media attention will intensify, regulatory systems will engage, or internal trust weakens. Look, this is critical. Systems rarely fail from one pressure source. They fail when multiple pressures converge simultaneously. This is where hidden instability will become visible. In phase 5, the visibility threshold breach happens. So every complex system has a threshold. A point where internal instability will become external, undeniable. Once this threshold is crossed, narratives shift rapidly. Institutions respond quickly, and confidence collapses faster than structures can adapt. This is why collapse feels sudden, because visibility changes faster than structures can respond. So in phase 6, confidence will collapse. So in elite systems, confidence is not just, secondary. It is structural, because banks lend money based on what? Confidence. Partners act based on confidence. Institutions cooperate based on confidence. So when your confidence breaks, value evaporates really faster than assets can actually begin to be liquefied. This is often the most destructive phase of all the phases, not because of its physical loss, although that is terrible, but because of its trust, the reevaluation of it. There is even more. So in phase 7, centralized node removal. Many systems, especially centralized ones, rely on a stabilizing figure, one person, right? When that figure is removed, negotiation pathways will disappear. Internal coordination weakens and external interpretation will begin to shift. So the system does not immediately, collapse because just removal. It collapses because there's no replacement structure that actually exists to absorb that pressure. This is where fragmentation will begin. And we're going to discuss that right now. In phase 8, the fragmentation and exposure. Once structure actually breaks, assets separate. The entities are isolated. Investigations will begin, and internal systems are dissected individually. At this stage, the system no longer exists as a system. It exists as evidence. Now, each part is examined independently. Each dependency is traced backwards. Each flow will become visible. So then why does the collapse look so fast? From the outside, most of the process is invisible. So people that's looking in can only see the final exposure phase, the public reporting phase, and the institutional response phase. That is why collapse appears all of a sudden. But structurally, it is the final visible layer of a long, eternal process. See, Robert Maxwell, as a case example, is one of system collapse. See, his case illustrates this full pattern: long-term financial complexity, eternal dependency structures, increasing pressure in final phase, sudden removal of the central stabilizer, rapid exposure of the financial irregularities. It is, ladies and gentlemen, a textbook example of centralized systems collapsing underneath compounded pressure, and the visibility shift will start. Now, why these patterns actually repeat, across numerous times in history? Well, the reason really is similar. The reason that similar collapse structures appear in different cases is very simple. Not because the systems are connected, but because they actually operate under similar constraints, similar incentives, and similar human organizational behaviors. So, the complex systems actually involve predictable failure patterns, because pressure, ladies and gentlemen, behaves in predictability, and it is predictable in constrained environments. So if we reduce everything, right, to its core principle, systems do not collapse randomly. They collapse when internal complexity exceeds their ability to manage pressure underneath the external visibility. And when that happens, ladies and gentlemen, structure fails before narratives catches up. Confidence fails before assets adjust, and recognition of collapse always lags behind the real reality. But the most important takeaway of this podcast is not about any single individual or Robert Maxwell's case. It is about systems themselves. The more complex and dependent a system becomes, the more fragile it is underneath sudden visibility and loss of central coordination. Sorry about that. I think that probably would be the biggest takeaway from this. Ladies and gentlemen, this has been the episode on Robert Maxwell. It has gone close to 2 hours long. I intended for it to be 1 hour long, so we went way more into detail. So I'm hoping maybe the next one will be a little bit shorter. I still have a couple more of these to get through. I'm actually planning on possibly doing another Epstein related case one. However, I am planning on doing one on Hugh Hefner, Sean Carter, and then a surprise reboot. Again, this has been Mike for Mike's Random Thoughts. Hope everybody enjoyed. I'll see you guys on the next one for sure. Everybody have a great day.